Hello and welcome to my channel. Before moving on, hit the like button and subscribe and press the bell icon and comment your country. In the chilling early days of January 2013, the lifeless body of 42-year-old Clint Harrington was found sprawled across the grand hallway of his luxurious mansion in Highland Ridge. This exclusive neighborhood in Dallas, Texas, was known for its quiet opulence, but Clint's death brought a storm of scandal to its pristine streets. The investigation that unfolded painted a harrowing picture of betrayal, obsession, and greed. Months before this shocking discovery in the fall of 2012, Melissa Harrington, Clint's stunning wife of 15 years, had a fateful encounter with their mysterious neighbor, Jack Bernett. What followed was a series of events that tore apart the illusion of the Harringtons' perfect life. The truth behind their glittering facade unraveled, culminating in a crime so startling that it left the entire community shaken to its core. In the still dark hours of January 1st, 2013, at precisely 3:14 a.m., the tranquility of Highland Ridge was shattered by a frantic 911 call. Melissa Harrington's voice, trembling and broken, reached the dispatcher as she struggled to describe what she called a terrible accident. Her husband, Clint Harrington, was on the floor, bleeding. The gravity of her words only became real when first responders arrived at the Grand Harrington estate. The mansion, a sprawling symbol of unparalleled wealth and prestige, stood eerily silent in the early morning hours. Its towering windows reflected the last faint flickers of New Year's Eve fireworks glowing in the distant skyline. But inside, the contrast was stark and shocking. Evidence of a lavish celebration was scattered everywhere. Half-empty champagne flutes, crushed remnants of confetti beneath expensive shoes, and untouched hors d'oeuvres resting on gleaming silver trays. Amidst this splendor lay the chilling centerpiece of the scene. Clint Harrington's lifeless body sprawled on the cold marble floor. Clint's lifeless body lay sprawled across the marble hallway, his once pristine designer tuxedo soaked in a deep crimson stain from a single gunshot wound to the chest. Just inches away, a polished silver revolver rested on the floor, its surface catching the flickering light of the ornate chandelier above. The surrounding chaos painted a picture of a violent struggle: overturned furniture, a shattered champagne flute close to Clint's outstretched hand, and faint scuff marks suggesting desperate movement before the fatal moment. When detectives arrived, they were struck by the haunting contrast between the splendor of the scene and the grim reality at its center. This was no ordinary crime scene. Melissa Harrington, still clad in her glittering evening gown from the night's grand festivities, sat huddled in the corner of the living room. Her appearance was far from the polished hostess she had been mere hours earlier. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears that refused to stop. Witnesses later recounted seeing her trembling violently, clutching a glass of water offered by one of the officers. Despite Melissa's repeated claims that the shooting was a tragic accident, her vague and inconsistent answers about the sequence of events raised immediate suspicion. The tension in her voice and her inability to explain the details left detectives unconvinced. The investigation began almost immediately after Clint's body was removed from the mansion. Detectives wasted no time piecing together the events that led to the chilling discovery. The New Year's Eve party, a lavish, meticulously planned affair, had been the highlight of Highland Ridge for weeks. Over 50 guests, including close friends, business associates, and neighboring elites, had been invited to this glittering spectacle. To everyone in attendance, the Harringtons appeared to be the ultimate power couple, hosts who wore smiles that masked the storm brewing beneath the surface. But among the crowd, one guest stood out like a shadow against the dazzling backdrop: Jack Bernett. Known for his charisma and enigmatic charm, Jack had only recently moved to the neighborhood. He attended the party unaccompanied, and though his invitation had been extended as a courtesy, Clint Harrington reportedly bristled at his presence. Jack was no stranger to controversy. While some viewed him as a harmless socialite with a penchant for stirring conversation, Clint saw him as something far more ominous, trouble waiting to unfold. The two men had clashed before, their disputes stemming from petty neighborhood squabbles. Yet, for Clint, Jack represented an unpredictable threat, one he had long tried to keep at arm's length. By January 2nd, 2013, detectives began reconstructing the events of the fateful New Year's Eve party. Witnesses painted a picture of a night fraught with underlying tension, one that seemed to intensify as the hours passed. Many guests recalled Clint becoming increasingly agitated as the evening wore on, his demeanor shifting from composed to visibly irritated. Several attendees reported hearing raised voices emanating from the study, a private room where Clint, Melissa, and Jack were briefly seen together. While no one could provide exact details of the argument, it was clear that emotions were running high. Clint and Jack had exchanged heated words, and Melissa appeared to be caught between them, desperately trying to mediate. On January 5th, 2013, detectives unearthed a key piece of evidence, surveillance footage from the Harrington estate. The recordings offered a glimpse of the escalating drama. Shortly after midnight, Clint and Jack were captured on the back patio, their body language indicating a tense confrontation. Moments later, Melissa appeared, her hurried steps and frantic gestures suggesting an attempt to defuse the situation. After a brief but intense exchange, all three disappeared back into the house. That would be the final recorded moment of Clint Harrington alive. Melissa Harrington's actions in the days following her husband's murder did little to quell the mounting suspicion surrounding her. On January 8th, 2013, she was brought in for formal questioning. From the moment she entered the interrogation room, it was evident that she was struggling to maintain her composure. Her demeanor was fraught. She seemed dazed, her responses inconsistent and contradictory. When asked about the events leading up to Clint's death, Melissa's answers shifted uncomfortably. At one moment, she claimed not to have witnessed any altercation between Clint and Jack. In the next, she admitted that she had stepped in to try and separate them during an argument. This constant back and forth raised immediate red flags for investigators. Adding to their concern was her defensive attitude whenever the subject of her relationship with Jack Bernett came up. Melissa steadfastly insisted that the shooting was a tragic accident, possibly the result of a misfire during a heated struggle over the gun. But her account was riddled with unanswered questions. Why had a firearm even been introduced into the situation? And if a struggle had ensued, why hadn't anyone else at the party heard it? Neighbors who had remained at the Harrington estate well into the early hours provided additional troubling details. They mentioned seeing Melissa vanish for extended periods during the party, her whereabouts unknown during the critical moments leading up to Clint's fatal encounter. These gaps in her story only deepened the mystery surrounding her involvement. By this point, the media had latched on to the unfolding scandal, turning Clint Harrington's death into a headline-grabbing mystery. Speculation ran wild as reporters dug into every facet of his life. Some suggested that Clint's reputation as a ruthless businessman might have made him enemies, opening the door to theories of professional revenge. Others focused on the Harringtons' marriage, hinting at a web of jealousy, greed, and betrayal that could have fueled the tragedy. However, one name stood out above all others: Jack Bernett. His involvement, both direct and indirect, was a recurring thread in every version of the night's events. To the public, he was a magnetic but suspicious figure, a man whose presence seemed to ignite the chaos that ultimately led to Clint's demise. The investigation was still in its early stages, but the narrative was already taking shape. At the center of it all were three entangled lives, a crumbling marriage, a mysterious intruder, and a gunshot that shattered not only a family, but the illusion of control in a world of wealth and power. The fall of 2012 marked the beginning of a turning point in Melissa Harrington's carefully curated life. For 15 years, she had played the role of the ideal trophy wife, standing gracefully by the side of Clint Harrington, a man whose magnetic presence and razor-sharp wit made him the center of attention in any room. Clint embodied the very essence of Texan wealth and power, with a fortune amassed through decades of ruthless dominance in the oil industry. But Clint's charisma came with a shadow, a controlling nature that extended to every aspect of his life. His empire, his public image, and even his marriage were meticulously managed. For Melissa, the glamour that surrounded their life often felt hollow. Despite being admired by many, she increasingly felt like little more than a polished ornament in Clint's collection of successes. It was during a neighborhood barbecue in late September 2012 that Melissa encountered Jack Bernett for the first time. She could never have anticipated how profoundly this meeting would alter the course of her life. Jack was unlike the other men in Highland Ridge. While Clint's power and wealth were boldly displayed, Jack's allure was rooted in his mystery. As a relatively new addition to the gated community, Jack had a way of captivating those around him, making each person feel like they were the only one in the room. Melissa was no exception. As the smell of grilled steaks filled the air, Jack's casual charm worked its magic. He peppered Melissa with compliments, words that felt like a lifeline after years of Clint's cold indifference. Jack's flattery was never overbearing, but rather persistent in a way that left her feeling noticed and desired. For Melissa, this attention was intoxicating, a sharp reminder of the passion her marriage so painfully lacked. In the weeks that followed, their paths seemed to cross more frequently. Jack always managed to appear, whether jogging past her house with a friendly wave or casually running into her at the upscale market where she shopped. By October, the chemistry between them was impossible to ignore. Their stolen glances evolved into clandestine meetings at quiet motels or secluded spots away from the watchful eyes of their affluent neighborhood. For Melissa, these fleeting moments with Jack offered a thrilling escape from the suffocating control Clint wielded over her life. But as her connection to Jack deepened, his charm began to take on a darker edge. What once felt like attentiveness soon turned into possessiveness, and his flirtatious demeanor shifted toward veiled threats whenever she tried to distance herself. Despite the warning signs, Melissa clung to the affair. Her yearning for freedom and the validation Jack provided kept her entangled in a relationship that was as exhilarating as it was dangerous. As the end of 2012 approached, Clint unknowingly set the stage for the dramatic unraveling of his carefully constructed life. On December 31st, 2012, he threw one of his iconic New Year's Eve parties, a glittering event that was as much about reinforcing his social and business dominance as it was about ringing in the new year. The Harrington estate was transformed into a vision of luxury that could have graced the pages of an upscale magazine. The sprawling property glowed with dazzling lights, the rhythmic melodies of a live jazz band filled the air, and guests sipped from glasses of the finest champagne money could buy. Melissa seamlessly slipped into her role as the elegant hostess, gliding through the crowd with practiced poise. Her warm smiles and gracious greetings betrayed nothing of the inner turmoil she carried. Beneath the sparkle of the evening, a storm was quietly brewing. Notably absent from the guest list was Jack Bernett. Clint had deliberately excluded him, a decision Melissa believed stemmed from Clint's unease about Jack's reputation. Clint likely had no inkling of the deeper secret Melissa was hiding. But Jack was not a man to let social expectations dictate his actions. As the evening unfolded, Jack Bernett made his entrance, uninvited and unbothered. Dressed to perfection and exuding his signature charm, he strode into the party as if he belonged there. When confronted by curious or disapproving glances from guests, Jack simply laughed it off, declaring, "How could I miss the best party in town?" The sight of him stopped Melissa in her tracks. Her heart sank as dread washed over her. She had begged Jack to stay away, warning him that Clint's temper was not to be tested. But Jack's cool, confident expression left no doubt he had no plans to be an observer that night. As the party carried on, Jack kept to the shadows, his presence quietly unsettling. His eyes followed Melissa wherever she moved, their intensity growing with each passing moment. Melissa's unease deepened, and she struggled to maintain her composed facade. Meanwhile, Clint, ever alert to disruptions in his world, began to notice Jack's unwelcome presence. By 11 p.m., the tension in the air was unmistakable. Guests exchanged knowing glances and whispered in hushed tones as Clint's demeanor shifted from celebratory to stormy. His darkening mood cast a shadow over the glitzy gathering, setting the stage for what would soon become a night of unforgettable chaos. By 11:30 p.m., the fragile layer of politeness holding the evening together shattered. Several witnesses later described seeing Clint storm into the study, a room of refined elegance adorned with dark leather furniture and shelves stocked with his prized collection of vintage whiskey. Jack followed close behind, and within moments, the muffled sounds of a heated argument began to leak through the thick oak doors. Guests standing nearby strained to catch fragments of the confrontation. Clint's voice, sharp and furious, accused Jack of overstepping boundaries. Jack's replies, though quieter, carried an unmistakable edge of mockery, as if deliberately stoking Clint's temper. The tension escalated until Melissa was seen rushing toward the study, her movements hurried and anxious. She slipped through the door, shutting it firmly behind her, leaving the crowd to speculate on what was happening inside. The minutes that followed felt excruciatingly long to those waiting outside. When the three finally re-emerged, the atmosphere was unmistakably charged. Clint's face was flushed with anger, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. Melissa looked distraught, her tear-streaked face hinting at the emotional storm inside. Jack, in stark contrast, exuded a calculated calm. His faint, almost smug smile seemed designed to provoke Clint even further. The air was thick with unspoken tension, foreshadowing the chaos yet to come. Though the three of them eventually went their separate ways within the house, the damage had already been done. Clint's carefully constructed dominance had been tested, and in front of his peers, no less. Meanwhile, Melissa's polished demeanor, a shield she had worn for years, began to crack under the weight of the evening's events. As the final moments of the year ticked away, guests gathered on the estate's sprawling grounds to witness the grand fireworks display Clint had arranged as the pinnacle of his lavish celebration. Yet, two key figures were missing: Melissa and Clint. Witnesses later recounted seeing the couple near the main hallway just before midnight. Their body language was a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere outside. Melissa's animated gestures suggested she was pleading with Clint to de-escalate the situation, her movements urgent and desperate. Clint, on the other hand, stood rigid, his anger simmering just beneath the surface, ready to boil over. Not far away, Jack watched the tense exchange unfold. His expression was inscrutable, offering no clues to what he might have been thinking. But his silent presence only added to the volatile mix, a shadow looming over the unraveling Harrington household. As the clock struck midnight, the skies above Highland Ridge erupted in a dazzling display of fireworks. Cheers and laughter filled the air as partygoers outside celebrated the arrival of a new year. But within the walls of the Harrington mansion, the mood was anything but festive. A single gunshot rang out, its deafening crack slicing through the music and revelry like a blade. Guests froze in place, their joyous expressions quickly replaced with confusion and fear. Heads turned toward the house as silence rippled through the crowd. Moments later, Melissa stumbled into the living room, her face ghostly pale, her hands trembling uncontrollably. It didn't take long for the realization to sink in. The sound they had heard wasn't part of the fireworks display. Chaos erupted as first responders rushed to the scene. Inside the mansion, whispers filled the air as guests speculated in hushed tones about what could have happened. Some hurriedly left the estate, desperate to disassociate themselves from the scandal that was beginning to unfold. Others lingered, their morbid curiosity compelling them to stay and witness the aftermath. Meanwhile, outside, the fireworks continued to paint the night sky in brilliant bursts of color. Their vibrant beauty felt cruelly ironic against the grim reality of what had just transpired inside. December 31st, 2012, would forever be remembered as the night Highland Ridge's glamour gave way to an unforgettable tragedy. In the days following Clint Harrington's shocking death, the scandal consumed the once pristine streets of Highland Ridge. Rumors swirled as whispers of betrayal, jealousy, and manipulation grew louder. Everyone speculated about what had truly happened on that fateful New Year's Eve. By January 2013, detectives had gathered initial forensic evidence and witness statements, but the story seemed to shift depending on who was recounting it. The case quickly revealed itself to be far from straightforward. Detective Carla Ramos, a sharp and experienced investigator known for her methodical approach, immediately recognized that this was no simple accident or random crime. The evidence pointed to raw, unchecked emotions, the kind that escalated into chaos and violence. The silver revolver found near Clint's body became the investigation's first major clue. Its polished surface bore smudges of blood and the telltale signs of multiple fingerprints. Forensic analysis identified two distinct sets: Melissa's, which corroborated her claim that she had struggled to wrest the gun away, and another partial print belonging to Jack Bernett. This discovery not only placed Jack at the heart of the crime scene, but also raised a critical, puzzling question. What was Jack doing near the gun at all? Forensic analysis revealed traces of gunpowder residue on Melissa's hands. Though she maintained that the residue was from her desperate attempt to wrestle the weapon away from Clint, the findings suggested she had been much closer to the gun when it fired than she was willing to admit. Compounding the mystery were the bruises found on Clint's arms during the autopsy, which pointed to a physical struggle. But the question remained: had Clint been trying to defend himself, or was Melissa struggling to prevent him from pulling the trigger? Detective Ramos meticulously reviewed the evidence, but while the physical clues were telling, they didn't tell the whole story. To piece together the narrative, she and her team began interviewing witnesses, a process that only muddied the waters further. One of the most significant revelations came from Melissa's closest friend, Sandra Taylor, who stepped forward reluctantly. Sandra had been a quiet observer of the Harringtons' marriage for years, privy to the cracks in their seemingly perfect union. According to Sandra, Melissa had confided in her just weeks before the party, revealing an affair with Jack Bernett. Melissa had admitted feeling trapped in an unhappy marriage and expressed fear over Jack's increasingly controlling behavior. Sandra claimed Melissa had even spoken about wanting to end the affair, but was too frightened of Jack's response. She described Jack's behavior as possessive, recounting Melissa's fears that his veiled threats about not letting her go might escalate. While Sandra's testimony painted Melissa as a woman caught in a volatile and dangerous situation, it also raised a troubling question. Had Melissa's unhappiness and desperation led her to take matters into her own hands? Witness accounts from the party only added to the growing complexity of the investigation. Several attendees described Jack Bernett as erratic and unsettling that night. They noted how his attention seemed locked on Melissa, his gaze lingering on her with a fixation that made some guests uneasy. One even recalled catching sight of Jack, observing Clint and Melissa from the shadows, his expression unreadable yet intense, a silent presence that radiated tension. In contrast, other witnesses pointed to Clint's own troubling behavior. A few described moments when Clint's frustrations boiled over, his temper visible in the way he tightly gripped Melissa's arm during heated exchanges. These actions left onlookers uncomfortable and suggested that the underlying tension at the party had been simmering long before the gunshot shattered the night. Meanwhile, Detective Ramos found herself increasingly troubled by Melissa's conduct during questioning. Her tears flowed without restraint, her voice frequently breaking as she recounted the night's events. Yet, despite the outward display of emotion, something about Melissa's responses felt carefully measured. Ramos noted how Melissa's words seemed overly rehearsed, as though she was meticulously crafting a narrative rather than simply relaying the truth. Beneath Melissa's grief lay a mix of fear and guilt that Ramos couldn't ignore. It was evident Melissa was concealing something important, but her motivations remained a mystery. Was she trying to shield herself, protect Jack, or preserve Clint's reputation? The answers eluded Ramos, but the sense of deception lingered. When Jack Bernett was brought in for questioning, his demeanor only deepened the intrigue surrounding the case. He exuded a calm, almost defiant confidence, steadfastly denying any involvement in Clint Harrington's death. Yet, despite his denials, Jack made no attempt to disguise his feelings for Melissa. He openly admitted he was in love with her and claimed that his only reason for attending the party was to ensure her safety. However, Jack's assertion that he hadn't pulled the trigger was at odds with a glaring piece of evidence, his partial fingerprint on the silver revolver. When confronted about this, Jack faltered. He failed to provide a clear explanation, and his composure, though resilient at first, began to waver. As Detective Ramos pressed him with increasingly pointed questions, cracks began to appear in Jack's polished facade. His calm demeanor slipped, revealing glimpses of a man who, like Melissa, seemed intent on steering the narrative in his favor. Whether his desperation stemmed from guilt or a desire to protect someone else remained unclear, but it added yet another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of lies. On January 15, 2013, the investigation took a dramatic and unexpected twist when an anonymous letter arrived at the police station. Neatly typed and devoid of any clues about its sender, the letter's contents sent ripples through the case. Its accusations were explosive. Melissa Harrington, it claimed, had carefully orchestrated her husband's murder. According to the letter, she was desperate to escape Clint's controlling grasp and start a new life with Jack Bernett. The letter painted Melissa as a calculating figure, alleging that she had intentionally provoked Clint into a heated argument, setting the stage for his tragic end. The motive, it suggested, wasn't purely emotional. It was financial. Detectives soon uncovered a critical piece of evidence to support this theory. Clint's will had been updated mere weeks before his death, leaving his entire estate to Melissa. The timing of this change coincided with whispers of Melissa threatening to leave Clint, a move that could have left her with nothing if she had followed through. This revelation shifted the narrative entirely. Melissa, previously viewed as a potential victim trapped between two domineering men, was now cast in a far more sinister light. Was she truly a victim of circumstance, or had she manipulated Jack into becoming a pawn in a calculated plan to escape her marriage and secure her future? On January 20th, 2013, the already fragile narrative surrounding Clint Harrington's death unraveled further when Jack Bernett made a reluctant and anguished confession. Struggling under the weight of his own involvement, Jack admitted he had been present at the moment the gun was fired, but his version of events turned the story on its head. He claimed it was Melissa who had pulled the trigger, acting in a fit of rage. This revelation stood in stark contrast to Melissa's repeated insistence that Clint had been the aggressor. Jack's confession was both shocking and incomplete. While it squarely implicated Melissa in the fatal shooting, it also left lingering questions about Jack's own role in the tragedy. Was he merely a bystander, an observer of a volatile situation spiraling out of control? Or had he played a more active and sinister role in the chain of events that led to Clint's death? Detectives were left grappling with these conflicting accounts, each laced with fragments of truth and deception. The case, already steeped in betrayal and mistrust, had become a labyrinth of shifting stories and elusive motives. By the close of January, the investigation had exposed a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and raw desperation that shocked even the most experienced detectives. Each new piece of evidence and every conflicting testimony added another layer to the increasingly convoluted narrative. What emerged was a portrait of three lives colliding in a storm of passion, betrayal, and ambition, an explosive combination that could only lead to tragedy. Yet, despite the wealth of evidence gathered, the absolute truth remained frustratingly out of reach. It was buried beneath the weight of conflicting motives, shifting stories, and the raw emotions of everyone involved. As the case edged closer to trial, one thing was abundantly clear. The death of Clint Harrington was not just a crime. It was the catalyst for a story far from its final chapter. On a brisk March morning in 2013, the trial of Melissa Harrington commenced, a day eagerly awaited by everyone in Highland Ridge. The courtroom was alive with quiet murmurs as residents of the affluent community gathered to witness the unfolding of a case that had upended their tranquil lives. Melissa arrived in court wearing a somber black suit, her once glamorous presence reduced to a pale and weary figure after months of scrutiny and stress. Jack Bernett, seated at a distance, awaited his own trial, though the fates of the two were already inseparably intertwined. From the outset, Melissa's defense adopted a daring strategy, painting Clint Harrington as a controlling and domineering husband. They characterized him as a man whose insatiable need for power left Melissa trapped and suffocated in their marriage. According to the defense, the events of that fateful New Year's Eve were the culmination of years of repression and fear. Melissa's attorneys argued that she had acted in self-defense during a volatile confrontation that spiraled beyond her control. They pointed to the bruises found on Clint's arms as evidence of a physical altercation, framing Melissa's actions as those of a woman desperately trying to escape harm. The defense's narrative sought to recast Melissa not as a manipulative schemer, but as a victim who had been pushed to her breaking point. The prosecution wasted no time in tearing apart the defense's portrayal of Melissa as a victim. Midway through the trial, they presented a piece of evidence that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. A voicemail Clint Harrington had left for Sandra Taylor just hours before the ill-fated party. In the recording, Clint's voice was audibly strained but calm as he warned Sandra about Jack Bernett. He described Jack as a dangerous influence, claiming that Jack was manipulating Melissa and steering her down a destructive path. This revelation flipped the narrative entirely. Rather than an abusive aggressor, Clint was recast as a man struggling to protect his wife from a situation spiraling out of his control. The voicemail also brought Sandra Taylor into sharper focus. As the contents of the recording were played in court, all eyes turned to her. Her presence, already uneasy, became laden with implication. During cross-examination, Sandra's role in the tragic events of New Year's Eve came chillingly to light. Melissa had confided in Sandra about her affair with Jack and her growing fear of both Jack's possessiveness and Clint's temper. Instead of supporting her friend, Sandra had betrayed her trust. She admitted to tipping Clint off about the affair, a decision that unknowingly set the stage for the volatile confrontation that ended in bloodshed. Sandra's betrayal was not born of malice, but rather jealousy and frustration. For years, she had watched Melissa's life from the outside, envying the wealth, beauty, and prestige that Melissa seemed to enjoy. That envy, combined with her own private grievances, led Sandra to make a fateful decision. She tipped Clint off about the affair. What Sandra couldn't have foreseen was the devastating chain of events her interference would unleash. As the courtroom absorbed the shocking revelation, attention turned once more to Melissa. The defense's carefully constructed portrayal of her as a victim began to collapse under the weight of this new evidence. The prosecution seized the opportunity to craft a far more nuanced narrative. Melissa as a woman who had courted disaster, skillfully manipulating the people around her to engineer an escape from her marriage. This escape, they argued, was steeped in deception and betrayal. The voicemail left by Clint became a haunting piece of the puzzle, offering a glimpse into his perspective. It painted him not as a domineering aggressor, but as a husband desperate to save his marriage. Clint had seen the storm brewing on the horizon, an outsider threatening his life and home. But despite his efforts, he had been powerless to stop it. The prosecution strengthened their case with a critical piece of financial evidence: Clint's will, which had been updated just weeks before his death to leave his entire estate to Melissa. They argued that this created a clear and compelling motive for murder. Combined with Jack Bernett's partial confession implicating Melissa, the evidence against her was steadily mounting. By the midpoint of the trial, the jury was fully engrossed in the unraveling of a case that had initially appeared to be a straightforward domestic tragedy. Testimonies painted a chilling image of Melissa's actions in the weeks leading up to Clint's death. Emails exchanged between Melissa and Jack revealed the depth of their affair. The messages depicted a volatile relationship, with Jack pressuring Melissa to leave Clint and Melissa expressing growing fear over Jack's possessive and increasingly erratic behavior. The defense, however, struck back by shining a spotlight on Clint's controlling tendencies. Witnesses recounted instances of tension within the Harrington marriage, describing Clint as a man prone to frustration and dominance. These moments painted a picture of Melissa as an isolated and desperate woman. The defense argued that she was trapped in a dangerous triangle: Clint's temper on one side and Jack's obsession on the other, pushed closer and closer to a breaking point. The trial reached a dramatic crescendo when Melissa Harrington took the stand to testify in her own defense. With tears streaming down her face, she described what she claimed were years of emotional abuse at the hands of her husband. She painted Clint as a man whose public charm masked a private life of control and domination. Melissa recounted the harrowing events of New Year's Eve, claiming that Clint had confronted her about her affair with Jack Bernett. She described how the confrontation escalated quickly into a heated argument that turned physical. According to Melissa, Clint, in a moment of rage, grabbed the revolver. She tearfully explained that she had struggled with him in an attempt to prevent him from using the weapon. It was during this chaotic struggle, she claimed, that the gun discharged accidentally, striking Clint. Melissa's testimony was highly emotional and laden with detail, capturing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. But her account began to unravel under cross-examination. The prosecution drilled into the inconsistencies in her story, pointing out critical gaps and contradictions. They also highlighted that none of the guests at the party had reported hearing the supposed altercation, casting further doubt on Melissa's version of events. The prosecution delivered one of its most powerful blows when they presented a text message Melissa had sent to Jack just days before the party. The text read, "I can't keep living like this. Something has to change. Soon." The chilling implication was unmistakable. This was more than a cry for help. It suggested premeditation, hinting that Melissa may have been planning her escape and that Clint's death was no mere accident. Jack's involvement in the trial was equally charged with tension. Though awaiting his own trial, he was brought to the stand to testify against Melissa. His demeanor was composed yet defensive as he recounted the fateful night's events. Jack admitted to arguing with Clint but denied any direct involvement in the shooting. When questioned about his fingerprints on the revolver, Jack offered an explanation. He had picked up the gun in the aftermath, attempting to wrestle it from Melissa after the shot was fired. While Jack's testimony dealt a heavy blow to Melissa's defense, it also cast him in a dubious light. His version of events painted him as a man deeply enmeshed in the chaos, raising questions about his true role in the tragedy. Was he an unwitting pawn in Melissa's scheme, a co-conspirator, or merely a bystander caught in a web of lies and deceit? The jury was left to grapple with these haunting possibilities. By the end of January, the investigation had pulled back the curtain on a labyrinth of lies, manipulation, and raw desperation that left even the most hardened detectives stunned. Every new piece of evidence and every conflicting testimony added another layer to a story defined by betrayal and chaos. What emerged was a harrowing portrait of three lives on a collision course, destined to end in tragedy. Yet, for all the evidence gathered, the absolute truth remained just out of reach, obscured by a dense fog of deceit and volatile emotions. Each participant's narrative seemed carefully crafted to protect their own interests, leaving the detectives and jury with more questions than answers. As the trial loomed on the horizon, one thing was painfully clear. The tangled story of Clint Harrington's death was far from reaching its conclusion. After weeks of emotional testimony and dramatic revelations, the trial reached its conclusion. On a somber April afternoon, the jury returned with their verdict after only a few hours of deliberation. Melissa Harrington was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court sentenced her to 25 years in prison, acknowledging the deliberate nature of her actions, but also considering the volatile and complex circumstances surrounding the case. Jack Bernett faced justice as well, convicted as an accessory to Clint's death. Though his role was deemed secondary, his influence over Melissa and his undeniable presence at the scene weighed heavily against him. Jack received a 10-year prison sentence, marking the end of his entanglement in the tragedy. Sandra Taylor, though never formally charged, did not escape unscathed. Her decision to betray Melissa's trust and inform Clint about the affair left her standing as an outcast in Highland Ridge. Once a respected member of the community, Sandra found herself ostracized, her name synonymous with treachery and scandal. The scandal that erupted in the wake of Clint Harrington's death left Highland Ridge irrevocably changed. What was once a neighborhood defined by affluence and prestige now bore the stain of betrayal, greed, and tragedy. Residents who had admired the Harringtons' seemingly perfect life, the wealth, the glamour, the powerful social presence, were forced to confront the sobering reality of how quickly such a facade could crumble. As Melissa was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, her face expressionless, the weight of the tragedy was unmistakable. The fallout from that fateful New Year's Eve had destroyed far more than Clint's life. It had unraveled the lives of everyone entangled in its web. For the community, the scandal left behind an unsettling question that lingered long after the trial's conclusion. How had so much darkness managed to remain hidden beneath the glittering surface of the Harringtons' world? Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and hit the like button. Comment your favorite part in the video.